I'll just give people a moment here to log on. We have 6 participants, but I think there's 40 or 50 signed up. So bear with us while we wait for the room to fill, as it were. We have 15 people now, so filling up quickly. Just give us a minute. We're ready to go, but we want to wait till we have most of the 50 or 60 people that were signed up. But I'm also not seeing the chat. Let's see. All right. Okay, well, oops, sorry. Little trouble with my Zoom control today, so. We have 20 attendees now. I think there were 50 signed up. And just another minute, and we'll start. While we're waiting for people to join in, if any of you want to communicate with me directly, it's just in Twitter, @John Englander. And there's other information on my website, johnenglander.net. And of course, on all the other social media these days. And there's the opportunity to put questions in the chat box on Zoom, which Nicole will, I think, share with me or read to me at the end. Okay, we're up to 27. So I think we're 3 minutes after. 1 more minute, we'll start. This is my new book. I guess it's fair to plug it. It came out last week, literally. Some of you read my first book, High Tide on Main Street. Moving to Higher Ground is an updated story, much better actually, updates the science and talks more about what do we do about the problem. It's available in all formats, print, ebook, audiobook, hardcover, etc. Okay, my name is John Englander. I want to talk to you about Florida's future, particularly storms, tides, and sea level rise. This being Climate Week, it's not going to be a surprise that the world is warmer. This is a depiction showing from NASA, by the way, that shows global average temperature. This picked the year 2018 versus the 20th century average. So the red is, obviously the warmer temperature, and it's in the Arctic, which has relevance to what we're going to talk about, the ice melting in a moment. But all of the world is warmer. There's one small area off Antarctica that's a light green, and that's because of all the meltwater that's coming off Antarctica, and the same thing off Greenland at the top. Both the light blue and the light green are the only 2 areas that are cooler over the last century, and that's because of all the melting that's happening from the ice on land. We use lots of different words to describe what's happening and all things related to climate, and they're all valid and they all communicate different things. And I would just encourage us to try and define the meaning of a word a little better so that we're talking about the same problem, because it's easy to get confused otherwise. Again, that's my Twitter if anybody does want to connect, follow, or reach out. But the 3 climate change issues that I like to define at the start so that we are using the same words. One is sustainability, a very popular word. And I use it in the context of rising sea level talk about slowing the warming as soon as possible by reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And that's certainly relevant as we back to that map where we just saw that the world was warmer. Resiliency is often talked about, but resiliency is something quite different. Resiliency is preparing to endure and recover from events, like it could be flood events, they could be heat waves, they could be wildfires, to prepare to reduce the impact of disruptions and to recover thereafter. Resiliency usually looks at what could happen in the next perhaps decade. But in addition to sustainability and resiliency, there's a third word we need to think about, and that's adaptation. We need to plan ahead for some things which aren't here yet and don't fall within the realm of resiliency for a near-term event, but where we can see where things are headed, and we need to begin to adapt in advance in terms of infrastructure and building codes and things like that. So sustainability, resiliency, and adaptation together make up the climate change issues from my definition. People may use different definitions, certainly. Whoops, what's happening? Sorry, there we go. Okay, in terms of coastal flooding, we can think of a couple of different kinds. There's storms, like a hurricane. There's heavy rainfall, and as rainfall goes down the valley, down to a lower elevation, or even to a lower street in a fairly flat city, that's runoff, and it can multiply the rain. So you could have 5 inches of rainfall, but it could turn into 15 inches down to a lower street. Then there's extreme tides, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Then there's rising sea level, and then there's erosion. Now let's start with storms. We all know what a hurricane is. This was Doria just a couple of years ago, having a big impact on the Bahamas and Florida. Coastal erosion, the last of the things I just listed, the sixth factor of what we think of as flooding. Coastal erosion is really not flooding per se. It means the land is being clawed away either by a very incremental daily process or during a storm. And we're all familiar with beach erosion. It's a growing problem all over the world. But the one that gets really to the heart of rising sea level is what we think of as extreme tides. Now, it's not just a Florida problem. This is San Francisco. If you've been to San Francisco, you've probably been down there on the Embarcadero, the famous wharf with Pier 39 and various restaurants and all the neat stuff in San Francisco. But what's useful to point out here is that the elevation in San Francisco was established 140 years ago. And they're not having subsidence where the land is going down in this area. It's pretty stable land. They're getting water sloshing over the seawall regularly during the year at king tide days. And that's happening because sea level is getting higher. Again, they have a good history here. They can look and see what's happening. And this isn't an ocean wave because, as you know, in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge is the bottleneck between the bay and the ocean. And so for Bay Chop, as is shown here, to get beyond Alcatraz Island, which actually is over there on the right-hand side, just slightly in view, to get around Alcatraz and be breaking on the seawall in the harbor of San Francisco, it's because sea level is higher, and when there's an extreme high tide, water now breaks over the seawall that didn't used to happen. In Florida, we're seeing variations of the same thing. Here's a neighborhood, happens to be in Broward County, but it could be anywhere around the state or any coastal state. And there's a storm drain, which was put in 50 or 60 years ago to take excess rainfall and move it down a pipe into the waterway. Now, even this is a blue sky or sunny day flooding event, or blue sky flooding as it's sometimes called. And that same drain is backing up and bringing salt water onto the street. That didn't happen 50 years ago when this neighborhood was designed. The difference is that sea level is rising as a base height. Here's Stranahan House, very famous landmark in Fort Lauderdale, 100 years old, one of the oldest historic buildings in South Florida. And again, it's not sinking there, but the water at peak high tide, certain days of the month and year, when we have these lunar high tides, king tides, the water is now coming up in a way that it didn't used to happen. It's submerging the dock. Whoops. We're seeing flooded streets. This is a no-wake zone on a street. You can see there's a truck off to the side there, but boats in the background. This is a street going down to a canal, very common in Florida. And they have a no-wake sign so that not boats, they're not trying to slow boats down. They don't want cars driving so fast that they throw a wake and get salt water up on other cars. Again, this didn't happen 30 or 40 years ago. This is happening because sea level is rising incrementally higher. And when we have an extreme high tide, we're having extreme flooding, not from a storm. But storms, tides, and sea level rise can all combine to cause flooding. What's happening with sea level? Well, if we look back to 1850, when we began having tide gauge records and measuring sea level globally, we can see that it's been rising. It's risen almost a foot in a century. But in the last 30 years, we have satellite data, which is much more accurate and precise. So if we look at the satellite data since 1993, where we can measure down to fractions of a millimeter, hundredths of an inch with some consistency. In the last century, sea level was rising 1.5 millimeters. Now that's about 20th of an inch, very, very small. But in the last 2 decades, it's been rising at double that rate, 3.2 millimeters a year. And in the last decade, it's rising at almost 5 millimeters a year. Now, it's this acceleration of the rate of sea level rise that's of greatest concern. Because just like the pandemic, when things change speed and go in a different direction, we can get a surprising result as the effects compound, just like interest rates, if you want to think about that. Compounding interest rate, either where you're a debtor or a lender, can have an amazing impact. Same with the pandemic, the same with sea level rise. And we're now in an era when sea level rise is accelerating. To put sea level in perspective, which is what I do in my books and lectures and consulting, it's to help people see that there was a natural phenomenon, but most of us weren't aware of it. If we look back to the last ice age, which would peak 22,000 years ago, that was the cold spot. And I'll show you more images of the ice sheet in a minute, but just to give you the big picture cross section here, sea level some 20,000 years ago was 390 feet lower. It rose, but the rate of rise changed, as you can see in the 3 blue arrows. And it got to the present level about 6,000 years ago, more or less. That's pretty much recorded human history. You think back to the Christian era is 2,000 years and the Old Testament days are 5,000 years or so. We do tend to think back to thousands of years, but they all kind of blend together for us. It's hard to imagine, but it's geologic, absolutely rock solid information that sea level hasn't changed much in about 6,000 years, but it was 390 feet lower just 20,000 years ago. If we put that against a modern office building, that's a rise of 30 floors of an office building. And if all the ice on the planet melts, if we allow it to melt or cause it to melt, sea level will rise another 17 floors or 212 feet. That's why this is very serious, but confusing. Now, Florida, we all know its shape today. It's very iconic. Anybody in the world could probably pick out Florida just by its shape. 20,000 years ago, when sea level was almost 400 feet lower, Florida was twice the size. The banks pretty much off to the west coast of Florida were all exposed and were dry land when sea level was down 400 feet. And conversely, 120,000 years ago, and I'll come back to this in a minute in with greater understanding, sea level got 25 feet higher and Florida was about half the size. That happened because of the Ice Age. And even if you just go back to the great animated cartoon series, Ice Age, The Meltdown, which came out in 2006, behind the critters or creatures, Manny, Sid, Diego, and etc., there's 2 miles of ice, 10,000 feet of ice. And that's reasonably accurate from the Ice Age. And as that 2 miles or 10,000 feet of ice melted, sea level rose 400 feet. That was the most recent Ice Age. Now, the Arctic melting today, and here's a polar bear who's, we could be concerned about his habitat. But as the Arctic goes from bright white to dark blue, which is the color of the Arctic Ocean, it's reflecting less sunlight and it's absorbing more heat. And that's making the problem worse. It's a feedback loop. You've probably seen pictures of icebergs. I'm going to take you to Greenland in a moment, but the icebergs are melting quicker. They're amazing shapes and so on. But icebergs are floating ice. And just like this picture of ice cubes in a glass, icebergs and ice cubes float 10% above the surface approximately. But surprisingly, as they melt, they don't affect the level of liquid. And you can run the experiment at home. Put ice cubes in a glass, not so many that they touch the bottom, mark the level of liquid, and when the ice is fully melted, the level of water won't change. The same with the icebergs. They're floating ice. It's when glaciers break off a chunk into a new iceberg or calve an iceberg, that's like adding another ice cube to the glass. That does raise the level of liquid. And also water that melts up on land, as shown here on this glacier, and gets to the ocean. That's like pouring more water in the glass. So new icebergs and meltwater from land ice raise sea level. Also something called thermal expansion of seawater. As the oceans warm very slightly, they get bigger, they expand, as many substances do when they warm. The potential problem for sea level, just to put it in perspective, is Antarctica and Greenland. As I mentioned earlier, if they all were to melt, we'd have another 200 feet of sea level rise. Now, it would take centuries, if not thousands of years for that to happen. So we shouldn't be worried about that, but it should make very clear why we need to get very serious about slowing the warming and slowing the melting, slowing the rise in greenhouse gases to get climate change back under control, which is the purpose of this Climate Week. This graph, it's in my books, by the way, and it's either my first book or the new one, but let me talk you through it. And it really helps to see the big picture. It's 400,000 years from left to right. The top line is carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, shown in green. Global average temperature is shown in red, and blue is sea level. Now, if we focus on the red line first, we can see the temperature goes up and down in a regular pattern. That is the ice ages, in fact. And as shown there, the last ice age peaked, the cold spot, the low point was 20,000 years ago. As mentioned, we've recently been in the Holocene, kind of a stable period of 11,000 years. But you can see that sea level or the climate moved up and down, warmer and colder, these regular ice ages every 100,000 years roughly. And that's been happening for 2.5 million years. That was a natural pattern, of course. Humans did not affect that. But when the world is warmer, it releases carbon dioxide from the ocean. And when the world is colder, more carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean. So that's why the red and green line historically have gone together for 2.5 million years. And when the planet's warmer, there's less ice, so sea level rises. So you can see why these three lines follow the same pattern very closely, almost exactly. The peaks line up, they're regularly spaced, more or less 100,000 years. And that would have been continuing, but we've changed the atmosphere. And the difference here is that carbon dioxide, as you can see in the upper right, the green line is now shooting straight upward. And whereas carbon dioxide had a range of 180 to 280 parts per million for millions of years, it's now at 415 parts per million. And indeed, we know, by the way, we know that data from ice cores that we sample in Greenland and Antarctica. But the issue is that these lines do stay in long-term synchronization over thousands of years, not year to year, but they're now, the temperature is going up and sea level is going up because the ice is melting, because carbon dioxide can cause warming as well as warming can release carbon dioxide. So either the red or green line can lead, but the other one will follow. And in a warmer world, the ice on Greenland and Antarctica will melt and cause more sea level rise. So that's kind of the big picture. You may also hear reference to Antarctic ice shelves. These are floating shelves, very flat, as you can see. They can be up to 1,000 feet tall. Here we're seeing about 80 feet above the water, which means it's about 800 feet down below the water. But these ice shelves are floating, so they actually behave somewhat like the icebergs in that as they break off or as they melt, they no longer affect sea level. Sea level was affected when the glaciers, you can see off in the distance here, there's a mountain on Antarctica, and that's a glacier in between the dark land forms. And as the glacier comes out onto the water, that's like putting more ice in the water, and that's when sea level is affected. Again, I don't want to get too deep into it here, but this is a cross section showing one of the big glaciers on Antarctica, the Pine Island Glacier. And you can see that the glacier's on land and it's stable or fairly stable relatively. The ice shelf protrudes out over the water. It's got its weight on the water, so it's already affecting global sea level. And then the icebergs. Now, what's interesting here is that the ice shelf and the glacier are now being eaten away underneath by the warmer, colder water. Greenland is the more urgent problem than Antarctica. Greenland is much bigger than most people realize. It's shown here in reference to the eastern United States for scale. It's pretty much the same size as the eastern United States. The icebergs, these are floating icebergs, are enormous. This is the top of the ice sheet on Greenland. I take groups there. Well, actually, the date, I used the date from last year. That trip was canceled. We're doing a trip this year. And if anybody's interested, there's 2 more seats or spaces available on these trips in late August. But the takeaways from all this, and I want to get to questions here in just a minute, is I think we need to slow the warming as soon as possible. Most of you know that. The primary way to do that is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. I consider this sustainability, as I said up front. There are other ways to slow the warming. We can try pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, either by planting trees or actually by machinery that does carbon capture and sequestration. Of course, getting off fossil fuels is important, and there's different kinds of fossil fuels, from natural gas to petroleum to tar sands to coal. Knowing that the planet is warmer or getting heavier rainfall and also more drought and more heat and also strange winter storms like the snowstorm in Texas a month ago, we need to design for better resiliency to future flooding events, to what's really the new normal in a warmer world. And then the third thing we have to do that most people set aside thinking we can somehow be sustainable enough or resilient enough that we don't have to adapt, but I would make the case that that's just not true. Even if we went to 0 carbon dioxide emissions, even if we could somehow make the world 100% renewable energy tomorrow, we're still going to get sea level rise. The reason is we've already warmed the oceans almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And all of the discussions are, can we stop the warming at double or triple that, even more heating? But the ice on Greenland and Antarctica is melting faster and faster, as I explain in my books. And because of that, sea level is rising faster and faster. Now, at the moment, as I showed earlier, it's only 6 millimeters a year, about 1/4 of an inch. But it's the acceleration rate that should concern us. Now, with the right knowledge and the right positive attitude, we can design things that can function in a world where there's more flooding. This is a town, part of Hamburg, Germany, Hafen City. And they've done some really clever landscape architecture to allow flooding to occur, even short-term flooding, as well as long-term sea level rise, and have a very livable city. course, the common question is, what can anyone do? First thing is, don't panic. Sea level rise is a slow phenomenon. It's not like worrying about a hurricane that could hit next week. Educate yourself and others. That's what you're doing today. Talk to your family, friends, neighbors, business associates, investment advisor, and elected officials. And then in your own case, evaluate your assets based upon your vulnerability of where you live, your age, your net worth, the percentage of your net worth that's at risk with your house, et cetera. You can consider either modifying your asset, like raising it, sealing a low window opening or raising a door threshold, selling it, moving, or depending upon your age and again, your wealth and other considerations, you might just want to enjoy it, and that's fine too. But we have to be realistic. We have to enjoy what we have, and Florida has lots to enjoy. But this is not just a Florida problem. This is all coastal communities. 10,000 coastal communities are vulnerable to more flooding from sea level rise. We have to realize that tides have always gone up and down daily. There's always been peak monthly tides at the new moon, and certain months of the year have these king tides or perigee high tides. We have to rise with the tides, but the tides are now getting higher. That's a surprising concept. In other words, we have high and low tide every day at the beach. We can see the beach line moving in and out, but the tide lines are getting higher and higher because sea level is getting higher. Sea level is like the drip filling the bucket. Its effect is cumulative. And you might visualize a bucket or a bathtub or anything where water is dripping in, drip dry by drip. You don't see the effect quickly. But now the drips are happening faster. We've tripled the rate of sea level rise in the last 30 years because the ice on Greenland and Antarctica is melting faster. These are ways to contact me. My new book came out just not even 2 weeks ago. It's available on Amazon, and some of the Barnes & Noble stores and other places have it. I'd be glad to answer questions now. I just have to figure out where this is. Oh, there we go, chat, sorry. I'm gonna close this because I'm gonna stop my screen share because that seems to be, okay, I think now I can see the chat. Can I email the slides? Is a question. Actually, if you send an email to slides@johnenglander.net, you'll get a set of slides. It's better if you wait till next week because I'm revising them because of my new book that's just come out. And actually, it'll probably be done by tomorrow, but don't download them just yet. So slides@johnenglander.net. And you can also put an inquiry in the contact form on my website, johnenglander.net. And the next question from Sandra is, what did you say? We've tripled in the last, I'm not too sure what you mean. So the rate of sea level rise a year is right now over 5 millimeters a year. 30 years ago, it was or last century, it was a third that. It was about 1.7 millimeters a year. I know we don't think in millimeters in the United States, but 6 millimeters is a quarter of an inch. So it's not that a quarter of an inch of sea level is noticeable or a problem. Of course, we're more worried about tides or storms. But the problem is that sea level rise is cumulative. And as shown during the last ice age, sea level can go up and down hundreds of feet. We know that's happened in the past, and it's going to happen again, not necessarily hundreds of feet, but we're going to get feet of sea level rise. And we have to separate our ability to slow the warming, which is most of what Climate Week is about, which is great, and being more sustainable, and recognizing that sea level changes naturally as well as what we're causing now. So again, as I showed in those graphs, 120,000 years ago, sea level was naturally 25 feet higher without human impact. So we have to do both. We have to slow the warming, and we have to prepare for rising sea level, which is going to happen at this point, even if we are able to stop the warming entirely, because the ice is melting. And again, this was a natural phenomenon. We just generally weren't aware of it. How many feet of sea level rise are already baked in? Good question, John. It's hard to say. It's not so much eventually baked in, it's a time frame. How quickly can you melt the ice? And because we're warming at an unnatural rate, there's not an absolute answer to that. Various estimates have this century anywhere from 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise. Anything in there would be catastrophic. So my concern and my advice to anybody that will listen, either in my books or my consulting or big presentations elsewhere in the world, is plan for the worst and hope for the best. But I think if you can, even though most of us won't be alive 100 years from now, if we think that 100 years from now we could have 8 or 10 feet of sea level rise, we're going to think differently about designing houses and zoning and building codes and lots of things like that. And the last point on John's question of how many feet are baked in, here's kind of the really disturbing thought from geologic history, is that if you go back to that chart I showed with the 400,000 years, sea level changes about 400 feet and global average temperature changes about 9 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 Celsius with the ice age cycles. Dividing one by the other yields, we get about 20 meters of sea level rise per degree Celsius or 35 feet per degree Fahrenheit. We've already had a degree Celsius, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So in terms of what's baked in, if we were to fast forward several centuries, we probably have 40 or 50 feet baked in. But hopefully that wouldn't show up for 500 years. And in that case, we could probably adapt to it. But the problem is how quickly we warm. As long as the planet keeps getting warmer and warmer, the ice will melt faster and faster. But your fundamental question is, how quickly are we going to melt those ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica? And depends on how warm we get the planet. The problem is we're still arguing about our energy policy and different things that could slow the warming. We don't know how warm the planet's going to be. I hope that answers the question. Nicole, I just see 3 questions here, but I think you also sent me some earlier. Let's see. Somebody asked a question actually before the session started. Will the rise in sea level change the magnitude between high tide and low tide, or will they each rise proportionally? Essentially, they'll both rise proportionally. If you raise the base height, and high tide and low tide are essentially going to stay the same. Now, high tide and low tide vary daily, monthly with the moon cycle, and then as the planets align, that's this king tide cycle. So even high and low tide are a little more subtle than we might think. We just tend to see the gross measurements at the beach or in a marina. Somebody else asked me to speak to the various scenarios of NOAA high versus intermediate. What is likely to happen? Well, as I said, the various 5 scenarios put forth by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which does an excellent job, say we could have anywhere from 2 to 8.2 feet this century. That's their latest estimate. The problem is it depends on how warm the planet gets, and we don't know that. We don't know whether we're going to halt the warming at another degree Celsius, which is 1.8 or rounded up to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, or whether it's going to be 2 degrees or 3 degrees. That's the discussion that's in the news these days. Even with the news this weekend that China and the US were talking about working together to try to limit the rise in greenhouse gases. But even if we stop the greenhouse gas rise exactly where it is, burn no more fossil fuels, we're still going to get sea level rise. And that's the disturbing, surprising, and usually overlooked fact. That's why we have to do all 3. We have to work on the sustainability, the resiliency, and adaptation. I think there was one more question. Oh, what would be the result of a direct strike from the Gulf of a Category 5 storm on Tampa Bay? We experienced Hurricane Katrina in coastal Mississippi with a 27-foot tidal surge. Well, I think you've answered your own question, actually. Hurricanes can't be predicted years in advance. We don't know how bad they're going to get. We are seeing more extreme hurricanes and strange storm patterns. as you know, as we all know, the impact of a hurricane is very much by its exact trajectory, direction of movement, and what the topography is like where it goes ashore. So there's no way to generalize and give an answer on that. We just, since hurricanes are driven by excess heat in the ocean, and the oceans are getting warmer and warmer, it's reasonable to assume that there's a good chance of stronger and more extreme hurricanes, but that's really hard to predict for sure. I stay with sea level rise because I can tell you for sure that in a warming world, there will be less ice on land and sea level will be higher. There's no doubt about that. It's incontrovertible. And although people would like to say, well, they don't see sea level rising, the truth is it is rising at about 1/4 of an inch a year, and it's easy to overlook that. But we also know that sea level, the flooding and the coastal flooding, as I showed you in the early slides, gets worse every year. All over Florida, all over the eastern United States, the Gulf of Mexico, frankly, all over the world is seeing more and more coastal flooding. And it follows the patterns we're seeing with sea level rise. That 1/4 of an inch a year right now, 6 millimeters, will increase almost certainly because of the heat energy stored in the ocean. Sea level rise will accelerate. We won't really notice it maybe for another 10 or 20 years, but by mid-century, we could have 1 foot or more of sea level rise, and that would be a real problem. Will be a real problem. Okay, do we have any more questions?
Hey, John, there's one. Given the accelerating sea level rise, should our Florida public policy mainly focus on adaptation and retreat rather than building walls and raising building elevations?
Thank you. I think it's all of the above, and it depends on where you're talking about, because the porous limestone of Southeast Florida, building a seawall, for example, as some may know, but let me explain this. So in a place where you had enough clay in the soil, and some parts of Florida do, you could build a seawall to try and keep the water out. But in Southeast Florida and the Bahamas and the Maldives and various places built on ancient coral reefs, where it's porous limestone, even if you build a steel seawall 10 feet high, the water is going to go through the porous rock that can go down 100 feet underwater, deep in the ground, and the water will go through the porous rock and just come up inland. So you have to look at the geology, first of all. So in some places you can build seawalls. In some places, the seawall becomes really a retaining wall to bring in more fill and raise the ground elevation to get higher above the water table and above potential storm surge. That's valid in some places. But we should be changing the building codes. We should be changing the zoning to think ahead, knowing that houses, our mortgage period is 30 years, but most buildings and infrastructure today can last 100 years. And so with that perspective, it's not so much the flooding that'll happen next week or next year. We need to design differently for the future. We had a concept that sea level was stable and the shoreline was stable, because of course, as sea level goes higher, it changes the shoreline. It goes further inland. So this concept that we all grew up with, including me, thinking that sea level was a certain height and a building was so much above sea level or something was below sea level, as if that was a static line, and sea level sets the shoreline, we didn't realize those were moving lines, that sea level could go up or down, and it's going up and will go up. And as sea level goes higher, the shoreline goes inland. Our very fundamental concept of real estate, of nations, we estimate that when sea level is 2 meters higher, more than 24 nations will disappear. So I think we've gone through the questions. As I say, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at John Englander. And if you have particular inquiries about speaking or other things, certainly use the comment or contact box on my website, johnenglander.net. And all of this is explained in more clarity in the new book, movingtohigherground.com, which you can see above me there. And it expands upon the first book, High Tide on Main Street. The question here, how much nations will disappear? Well, again, there's an estimate up to 30 countries are less than, I think, 3 meters, 10 feet below sea level, mostly in the South Pacific. The Bahamas is very low lying and will be badly affected, as would Southeast Florida. But the Bahamas do have some areas that are well above 10 feet too. So the Bahamas aren't going to disappear. They'll be impacted. But islands had different profiles. Like I've been doing some work in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a mile above sea level on most of the island. There's a rainforest, El Yunque, and that's almost mountainous if you want to think of it that way. And so while San Juan is down at a low elevation, most of Puerto Rico is above 10 feet above sea level. So each island or each location needs to be looked at differently. For example, people talk about Florida as if it's going to all go underwater. That's totally misleading. Orlando's 80 feet above sea level. Tallahassee's 200 feet above sea level. There's a whole string of old communities down the old ancient coral reef from Lake Wales to Sebring that are at least 100 and many of them 200 feet above sea level. So this idea that Florida's going underneath the waves is ridiculous. It's ignorant. We need to do 3 things. We need to slow the warming. We need to be more resilient and ecological and environmental, actually, so more than 3 things. And we need to intelligently adapt in advance of flooding, which is a slow phenomenon. I think I'm seeing one more question here. No. Oh, here we go. Sorry. I'm just trying to read this string of questions on the side here. Excuse me. Got the hurricane impact, tidal patterns change. Will tidal patterns change with rising sea level? For example, the difference between high and low, I guess we already did that one. Sorry. These must be in reverse order. Given the accelerating sea level rise, should our Florida public policy mainly focus on adaptation and retreat rather than building walls? That was the last question. Sorry, we've already done that. And again, I think it needs both. I think we need to look at how to reduce flooding in the next 5 or 10 years by better drainage systems. I think we need to realize that this is the early stage of sea level rising. We need to think about building codes and how they might change over the next 100 years. I like to talk about short, medium, and long-term planning. We do that in our lives and for our children's education or our retirement savings. If you think about 100 years as usually, a maximum human lifespan, but we can think out 100 years at any age, thinking of future generations. And if we try to leave the world not only a better place, but also a more functional and economically viable, we really should think about the long term, the 100-year frame. And with that, it's easier to think about the 30-year time frame, which gets us to mid-century, and then back that out to the next 10 years. And so those 3 different time frames, 10 years or so, 30 years to mid-century, and then 100 years getting us to 2120, that's a great range of perspective, and it calls for different responses. I think those are the questions so far. So thank you for your interest. It's been a good attendance, and I certainly appreciate the Volo Foundation from sponsoring the Florida Climate Week program. This is really important stuff, and it's obviously very diverse in Florida, from the Everglades to the coral reefs offshore that people love to dive on, the fish life, all the aquatic issues, all the different things that affect our quality of life here in Florida and surrounding states. Again, this is not limited to Florida. We could talk about flooding in Mobile or New Orleans or Galveston. We could go up the coast to Charleston and Savannah and Annapolis and Baltimore, and on up the coast to Portland, Maine, and Boston, Nantucket, out west to Vancouver or Seattle. All of these places are experiencing extreme flooding during high tide events. Here, John's asking, a foot of sea level rise at the mouth of the St. Johns River. Does that mean a foot of rise in Jacksonville, 13 miles away? Well, it depends. When you push water into a confined space, like an inland canal system or a river, like the Matanzas River up in, or St. John's in Jacksonville area, when you push a storm surge into a confined space, the water piles up. And so you get that storm surge bulge. So you could get, 2 feet in the ocean, but could be 6 feet inland in a river inlet. Without that confined water entrapment phenomenon, Jacksonville and, would probably be the same as the St. Johns River. Yeah. But water levels do vary because of coastlines and bays and, again, the canal system. So you can't assume that 6 inches of sea level rise is only 6 inches of water level where you live. It could be many times that because of water being entrapped during high tide or storm events. And remember, it's storms, tides, and sea level rise. It's actually storms, rain, runoff, extreme tides, and sea level rise, and then erosion. I taught the 5 forms of flooding plus erosion is the way I explain it in my books. We still got a few minutes. I was afraid of running over, and I talked quickly enough that I wanted to have time for Q&A. Last call for questions. All right, well, thank you very much for your interest. Thanks for attending Climate Week. And I'm sure there's lots to be learned yet. This is just Monday. Best wishes. Thanks.